want to welcome you to the first week of our Bluebell Poncho Loom Along. We are, over the next month or so, going to be walking through every row that will allow you to knit a Bluebell Poncho of your own. Before we get started with the actual knitting, let's talk a little bit about what you're going to need to be able to knit the poncho. For starters, you're going to need the AKB, the Authentic Knitting Board's Afghan loom. This poncho was knit on this loom with a worsted weight yarn. You need about 920 yards, roughly little less than 3 skeins of this Red Heart with Love yarn. It's a worsted weight yarn, nice and soft, 100% acrylic for those of us who don't like wool because it itches. But you can use whatever worsted weight yarn you want. Let's talk about looms. I've had the question asked, what happens if I don't have access or don't own this knitting loom? Is there an alternate loom that you can use? And the answer is yes. But let's talk a little bit about this loom, what makes it unique. This loom is a 7/16 inch gauge loom. What that means, when we talk gauge in loom knitting, we're talking about the distance from the center of one peg to the center of the adjacent peg. So it's 7/16 of an inch between these two pegs. Some alternative looms out there that you might be able to use would be, I've got some notes here I need to refer to. So you could possibly set up a Martha Stewart loom with pegs in every hole, small pegs in every hole. That loom, or even the Authentic Knitting Board's plastic hat loom. They're adjustable hat looms. I don't know, I haven't tried it, but I would imagine you could put together several sets of those and come up with enough pegs. If you're using a 7/16 inch gauge loom, you need we used all 198 pegs. If you're using a Martha Stewart loom or the Knitting Board's adjustable hat loom, those looms are 3/8 inch gauge looms. So their pegs are a little closer together. The bottom line is you're going to need a fabric. This is a rectangle. This poncho is knit as a rectangle. So you're going to need a fabric that's 62 inches wide, and then we knit it 22 inches deep. So you need a loom that allows you to knit a fabric, because we knit from, actually we're going to knit from the bottom to the top, but we knit long ways. So you need 62.5 inches worth of fabric that you can knit on it. So we used 198 pegs on this loom. If you're using a Martha Stewart loom or a hat loom, you need to be able to come up with, I'm guessing, if my math is right, somewhere between 230, 235 pegs is what you're going to have to cast on to achieve that same length. Some of you have asked, well, can I use a 1/2 inch gauge loom? Cindy Wood makes a universal loom that is 1/2 inch gauge. Absolutely. Again, if my math is correct, you're going to need between 170 and 175 pegs on a 1/2 inch gauge universal loom to come up with a 62.5 inch wide piece of fabric. Another alternative is a 3/4 inch gauge loom. So there's 3/4 inches between pegs here. And if you have a loom like this, you will need 115 to 120 pegs. You absolutely have to use whatever thickness of yarn works on the loom. Like if you used a worsted weight yarn on this 3/4 inch gauge loom, your fabric won't be as dense or as tight. It's going to be much looser. So you need to use bulky weight yarn if you're going to use this loom. If you're going to use the Martha Stewart or the Authentic Knitting Board's adjustable hat loom, you might want to find a little bit lighter weight worsted weight, like a Karen Simply Soft is usually a little thinner than this yarn. An absolute must. If you are not using the loom that I have used to build my poncho, you must knit a swatch. I know, I hate it too, but you got to do it. Because you're going to have to figure out, just knit some garter ridges. Purl one way, E-wrap knit the other. Knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. Do a bunch of rows till you have like a 4x4 inch piece of fabric, and then count. Set a ruler down and count. How many rows did it take to get 1 inch? And then how many stitches across? How many pegs did you have to cast on to get 1 inch? You got to use that swatch to calculate how wide or how many pegs you need to cast on to get a 62.5 inch wide piece of fabric. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about that. So let's assume, I'm going to go now and assume that everybody has an Afghan loom, and that's what we're using. The pattern is written as such. We do this section is kind of a lace type fabric, and then we do a section of garter rows, and then we do a section of Indian cross stitch, and then some more garter rows and some different things. What I will do is tell you, even though the pattern doesn't say it, if you were to buy the pattern, it doesn't give you all this if you're doing it with a different loom. It just tells you how to build it if you're doing it with that loom. So in the loom along, I will tell you, look, we're going to do this first section. If you're not using a loom that we're using, you need to do X number of inches of this type of stitch instead of do 15 rows. I'm going to tell you to, get your tape measure out and measure how many inches you have. All right, I think that covers everything at the beginning. Oh, I would recommend highly that you go to my 6 loom kit hacks, loom knitting hacks for your loom kit. Just some little basic tips that'll help you do your loom knitting a little easier. All right, we are going to set up and cast this baby on. All right, let's get going. We start this poncho. We knit from the bottom to the top, so we need to cast on. And the cast on that I've chosen for this poncho is the faux picot cast on. I have a separate YouTube video if you want to go watch that too. But it makes for a very pretty little picot cast on, and it's really not that difficult to do. You've got your Afghan loom. I would suggest you take some stitch markers and put it on your first and your last peg, because it's real easy. You get to knitting and you come back around and maybe you accidentally knit a couple pegs past where you were supposed to and you've closed this up. So I like to have some stitch markers there just as a visual reminder. Here's my start peg, here's my end peg, don't cross it, lady. So just a little helpful hint there. I am not going to knit an entire poncho again. What I'm going to do for this loom along is I'm going to use my all-in-one loom, and I'm just going to knit 10 pegs worth of every row. So I'll demonstrate for you how to do the row, and then you can go off and knit your row and then come back and knit the next row. Okay? So let's get started. Again, I'm using a worsted weight yarn. And I love using a yarn guide, and I'm going to use my little yarn threader. And again, if you haven't figured out how to do all these little tips and tricks and techniques, check out my video on the Loom Knit Toolkit hacks, because it really does speed up your loom knitting. All right. So the first step in doing the faux picot cast on is having a movable stitch marker, one that you can take out. Let me dig through my little toolkit. So here's my little movable stitch marker. Oh, I shouldn't do it in blue, huh? Okay, so here's my little stitch marker. I have made a slip knot, and I am going to stick that stitch marker in the slip knot. And you'll see why later. But basically, this stitch marker is going to come in handy about 3 rows in. So I'm going to assume that this is peg 1. We're going to put our slip knot on peg 1. Tighten it up. And we are going to half hitch cast on the number of pegs that I need to do for my poncho. Okay, so our pattern tells us we need to cast on 198 pegs on our Afghan loom. If you're not using that Afghan loom, you will cast on the number of pegs you calculated from your swatch. All right, half hitch cast on. This is my working yarn to the yarn ball. Take it like this, flop it over so that my working yarn to the yarn ball now is on top of the yarn from the peg, and then you lay it over and put it on the peg you want to go to. Okay, same kind of thing. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Okay, so the first step in the faux picot cast on is to half hitch cast on the number of pegs. The next step, the next row, is we're going to wrap knit back. In case you haven't noticed, I'm left-handed, so I cast on from left to right. For the right-handed folks out there that cast on from right to left, go for it. It works the same regardless of which direction you're going. So do what's comfortable for you. Okay, so I'm going to E-wrap and knit off every peg going back. I don't skip or slip any pegs. I want every peg to have an E-wrap knit on it. All right, and I'm going to knit those off. Okay. Row 2 says we slip one or skip the first peg, and then we're going to yarn over and knit 2 together. So that's worked over pairs of 2 pegs, and all that simply means is the first step is we pick up the loop that is on the first, or in this case it's peg 2, and move it to peg 3. So we yarn over, which simply means we lay the working yarn in front of the empty peg and knit 2 together. So here's the 2 stitches we're going to knit together. So we E-wrap the peg and knit those 2 off. We're going to work it again over the next pair of pegs. Move the loop from peg 1 to peg 2. Put the working yarn over the empty peg and E-wrap and knit off the second peg. You're knitting off 2 loops as one. We'll work it over the next pair of pegs. Move the loop from peg 1 over to peg 2. Lay the working yarn in front of or yarn over the empty peg, and we're going to E-wrap and knit off those 2 stitches over one on that peg. Work our next set of pegs. You move the loop, yarn over, E-wrap, knit 2 together. And then on my last peg, you just E-wrap, knit it off. Okay? For row number 3, we are going to E-wrap knit all. So 1, 2, 3. So you will do 198 pegs back. It always amazes me how much more difficult this is to do with a camera in front of you than when I'm just sitting knitting. All right. Okay. Now what we need to do is we place the cast on edge back onto the loom. So this movable stitch marker that I put on at the beginning, that tells me that this is my first loop to put back on the loom. I'm going to turn it this way so that maybe we can see it better in the camera. But so if you remember, we had that movable stitch marker through our slip knot. So that guy is going to come up and go back onto peg 1. So here's my peg 1. I'm going to put him back on peg 1. And then you just go each stitch down and put it back on the peg. Kind of like if you're doing a brim of a hat. Okay. And again, check out my video on faux picot cast on. Might be a little bit easier to see on that one. I used different thread or different yarn, different loom. Okay, so I've got them all back on the loom. Once they're back on, then you just lift, go back through and lift the bottom loop up over the top loop. Okay, so you'll do that on all of your 198 pegs. Okay. And what that accomplishes then, by doing that, where we had the yarn two together, or knit two together, I mean, the knit two together creates that little bobble. Okay. Row 4 then is we're just going to slip one or skip the first peg and U-knit to the end of the row. So we'll skip the first peg and U-knit. Okay, you knit to the last peg and then you E-wrap knit that last peg. Pay special attention to what I tell you to do on the first and last pegs, because that's what makes the pretty edging on your poncho. Let me see, where's my end at? Okay, see this? How it's a real pretty edge? So pay attention. If I tell you to slip or skip the first peg, make sure you do that. If I tell you to E-wrap knit the last peg, make sure you do that. Or if I tell you to U-knit, those different stitches are what creates this pretty edge. Okay? So that's it. That was the 4 rows of the picot cast on. Now we're ready to start the 3 knit lace section. This is what I call 3 knit lace section. I don't know if there's an official name for it or not, but it's a easy way to make kind of this nice little lacy look in here without having to move stitches or do some strange things. I call it 3 knit. Okay, so row 5 tells us to 3K all, or 3 knit every peg in the row. To 3 knit, all you do is E-wrap knit the indicated peg once, E-wrap knit the indicated peg twice, E-wrap knit that peg a 3rd time, and then you're done with that peg, you move to the next peg. E-wrap knit the next peg once, E-wrap knit that same peg twice, E-wrap knit that same peg a 3rd time, and so on. So all the 3 knit is just 3 E-wrap knits on the same peg before you move to the adjacent peg. 2 and 3. So we go 1, wrap 2, and 3, next peg. 1, E-wrap 2, E-wrap 3, next peg. E-wrap 1, E-wrap 2, oh come on yarn, and E-wrap 3. Next peg, E-wrap 1, E-wrap twice, E-wrap 3, E-wrap 1. I guarantee you this goes much faster if you're not trying to do this in an awkward position so the camera can get it. 2 and 3. 2 more. E-wrap 1, E-wrap 2, E-wrap 3, last one, 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to go ahead and remove my stitch marker from the cast on. Don't need that anymore. That was row number 5. Row 6, we are going to slip or skip the first peg, purl to the end. The last peg we're going to unit that peg. So it's slip 1, purl to the end, U1. So slip 1, purl, 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 and my last peg I'm going to unit. So, and I just dropped my pattern. All right, that was row 6. All right, row 7, we're going to slip or skip the first peg and unit every peg to the end. So we will slip or skip this first peg, and then we're going to unit to the end. And we unit the last peg. Row number 8, we're going to slip the first peg and we're going to purl to the last peg, and then we're going to unit that last peg. So it's slip 1, purl to the end, unit the last one. So I'm going to slip or skip the first peg, and then we're going to purl to the end. And we're to the last peg, so we're going to unit this peg. Okay, so that was row 8. So we are going to repeat rows 5 through 8 another 15 times. Okay, so have a row counter, have a piece of paper where you actually write, do tally marks. You're going to do rows 5 through 8 another 15 times for a total of, you've done 16 of those stitch patterns. Real quick too, at some point in this lace section you're going to need to add another ball of yarn. So go watch my video on the magic knot for loom knitters. That's the knot I recommend that you use to add another ball of yarn. Okay, so we have done our faux picot cast on and our first section of lace using the 3 knit stitch. If you are not using the loom we're using and you're using a different loom, different gauge, you need to make this lace stitch about 10 inches long. Okay? So 16 total repeats of this stitch pattern will give you about 10 inches worth of fabric. Alright, so that's it for our first week. Go grab your loom, your yarn, cast on, and get your first lace section done, and we will see you next week as we work on up the poncho. Hey guys, I just wanted to give you a word of encouragement. This first week is going to be the longest piece of the poncho. It's the most number of stitches, 19,800 by my calculations. So it is kind of a long section. If you don't get finished with it in the first week, no worries. These videos aren't going away, so you can continue working at your own pace. But if you do get through with it, then you're ready to move on to the second week. But this is the worst part of it. The next sections move along faster and there's not as many stitches to be done. So hang in there. The hardest part's up front, and then it gets easier and you'll have a great poncho when you're done. So hang tough, guys. You can do this.